Welcome to the Conservation Corps North Bay Training Module number 12, a brief introduction to cognitive behavioral therapy. The purpose of this module is to give you a brief introduction to the concepts and strategies of cognitive behavioral therapy. However, the module is in no way intended to train you in the use of cognitive behavioral strategies. Cognitive behavioral therapy is conducted by trained psychologists who are licensed to conduct this kind of therapy. Again, the goal is just to give you an understanding of the cognitive behavioral therapy model and the assumptions it is based on. Also, the purpose is to give you some suggestions and techniques you might use to redirect or refocus clients who may find themselves in a negative frame of mind over an extended period of time. Well, just to give us a background, we have been talking in many of the modules about the philosophical behavior change assumptions and their corresponding intervention strategies. And the relationship listening is based on the assumptions that change comes from within, from inside the individual, inside each of us, is the ability to solve our own problems and to work through our own issues and to come up with what is best for us. And that's the internal position. And these are techniques that we have already talked about in modules: critical listening, active listening, paraphrasing, I messages, I win, you win situations. In the confronting and contracting, or the middle position, which says that change comes about from the internal pressures and the external pressures, we have talked about the concepts of discipline and contracting and planning, and cognitive behavioral therapy falls under this middle position in the behavior change continuum. It's based on the assumption that change comes about from internal forces and from external forces, a combination of those. So that's where this module fits in the overall big picture. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy can be defined as a psychosocial intervention that aims to improve a person's mental health. It focuses on challenging and changing, one, our cognitive distortions, or our thoughts and beliefs and attitudes about things, cognitive distortions. Two, it challenges, and it talks about challenging and changing our behaviors that result from cognitive distortions. And three, it's focused on improving emotional regulation. Cognitive behavioral therapy's focus is on the development of personal coping strategies that target solving current problems. Now, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is problem-focused and action-orientated form of therapy, meaning it's used to treat specific problems an individual may be experiencing in the here and now, right now. And CBT is based on the premise that our thoughts, or cognitions, that's what cognitive means, our thoughts, our behaviors, or our actions, and our emotional responses, our feelings, are all interconnected, each influencing the others. Now, the model you're looking at on your screen demonstrates the reciprocal relationship between thoughts and cognitions, emotions or feelings, and behavior and actions. An example of how the model works will start with an activating event. So some event happens, some activating event happens to a person. And then the event may cause the person to have a thought or a cognition. And you can see what we think affects how we act and feel. And then our thought or cognition may cause us to experience an emotion or feeling. And our feeling or emotion in turn causes us to act or engage in some type of behavior. So our thoughts or our cognitions, our behaviors or our actions, and our emotions or feelings are all interconnected, and they all influence each other. Now, this interconnectedness between our cognitions, our behaviors, and our feelings has served us extremely well throughout evolutionary development. Consider the following. Assume it's late in the evening and you are walking through the savannah in East Africa. It's a new moon, so it's pitch dark and your vision is limited. You are quietly creeping through the tall grasses when suddenly you hear what sounded like a twig snapping. Immediately you have a thought, a cognition. Some nocturnal beast is on the prowl and is about to become their next meal. Now this thought causes your hippocampus, pituitary, adrenal axis to kick into effect, and you experience a strong emotion of flight or fight. Adrenaline starts to pump through your body. Your heart starts pumping faster, supplying more oxygen to your muscles. Your pupils dilate, increasing your ability to see. Your breath quickens so that oxygen can pour into your lungs. And you are ready to flee in fear. So, in this example, there was an activating event. You heard a noise. This event caused you to have a strong emotional response. That fight or flight kicked in, which resulted in a behavior or an action. You ran for your life. Well, as it turned out, the noise was really some nocturnal animal out to do you harm, but your quick response allowed you to escape this time. Okay, no problem. The activating event, thought, feeling, behavior, connection worked and saved your life. All is well. However, there can be times when your cognition or thought may be wrong, not a true interpretation of what really happened. There is some activating event leading to a thought, and the thought is incorrect. But since the system is interconnected, the incorrect thought causes you to experience an inappropriate emotion, which in turn leads you to engage in behavior or to take an action that may be totally inappropriate for the actual initial event. This faulty interpretation of an internal activating event and the resulting incorrect or inappropriate cognition, feeling, and action is the actual basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the graphic on your screen represents the cognitive behavioral model. There is the perception of an activating event, a situation. So something happens and there is a perception, your perception of it. Now this perception of the activating event leads to a thought. And this thought leads to an emotion or a feeling, which in turn leads to an action, a behavior of some kind occurs or takes place. Now, when the perception of the activating event is correct, when it really does represent what truly happened, then most likely the thought connected to the event will be appropriate, as well as the feeling connected to the event and the behavioral response to the event. However, when the perception of the activating event is incorrect, is faulty, when it does not represent what truly happened or what reality was, then most likely the thought connected to the event will not be appropriate, as well as the feeling connected to the event and the behavioral response to the event. This type of situation happens to all of us from time to time and presents no real problem. However, there are certain types of thoughts referred to as cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts that indicate that the way an individual is thinking about something doesn't necessarily match up with the reality of what is really going on. When an individual perseverates over cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts, this can present a real problem and can interfere and influence their daily lives and development. Cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts involve extreme thinking and are often the beginning of a negative loop that can have a person spiraling deeper and deeper into bad moods of depression, anxiety, stress, and etc., until they feel that there really is no way out of the situation. Now, the diagram on your screen represents this negative loop. Looking at the diagram, we can see that a cognitive distortion, like nobody likes me, can lead you to start to feel anxious and self-conscious around others, a feeling, which in turn causes sweating and heart palpitations, which are body sensations. This then may result in your choosing to withdraw from others, which is a behavior, resulting in you feeling feeling left out and alienated, which then produces another negative thought, such as, there's something wrong with me, which starts the cycle all over again until you disappear down the proverbial rabbit hole. These cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts are the core of how cognitive behavioral therapists work with individuals to change their moods. By helping individuals recognize when they are thinking distorted thoughts, they help people to begin to question these thoughts and then eventually replace them with more balanced thoughts. This may sound quite simple, but negative thinking is often a strong habit and is so entrenched that it actually may be unconscious and can be seen as totally normal by the individual. In other words, the individual may be having these distorted cognitions, but not really realize it and may think that this is normal. This is a normal way of thinking. Now, these cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts fall into categories. The following screen will define and discuss 10 typical categories of cognitive distortions and offer some non-clinical ways of assessing and intervening with clients who seem to have fallen into these negative loops. Okay, on the screen you'll see in a minute, we will briefly define and give you some examples of 10 categories of these cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts. The purpose is to make you aware of the types of negative loops or faulty thinking that people get caught up into. Let's take a look at the first one. The first one is referred to as black and white thinking. And black and white thinking, or all or nothing thinking, is the tendency to see things in terms of polarized categories with no recognition that actually most attributes lie on a continuum. Black and white thinking, or all or nothing thinking, it's either right or wrong. It's either black or white. There is no shades of gray. There's nothing in the middle. Some examples of things are usually not either black or white. There are shades of gray, and some examples of black and white: all people are stupid, or I'm a total failure. So those are some examples of black and white thinking, one of the categories. Another one is jumping to conclusions. When someone is jumping to conclusions, their conclusions are reached on the basis of incomplete evidence. So you're walking down the street and the woman says, he looked at me and then crossed the road to avoid me. He doesn't like me. That's an example of jumping to conclusions, also referred to as mind reading or fortune telling. And in the above example, the person is trying to read the mind of the other person. He looked me straight in the eye and have walked across the street to avoid me. So she's trying to read his mind. She doesn't know why the person walked across the street. Another example, I got up feeling tired. This is going to be my worst day. In this example, the person is attempting to predict the future, to do mind reading with little information to go on. There's no evidence that it's going to be the worst day. So that's jumping to conclusions. Another example of cognitive distortions is personalization, When someone personalizes a situation, they tend to feel responsible for things even when these things are beyond their control. It was totally my fault that they didn't enjoy the movie. Well, of course it wasn't totally your fault that they didn't enjoy. You have no control over whether they enjoyed the movie or wouldn't enjoy the movie. That is an example of personalization. Another example of a cognitive distortion is magnification or minimization. Oh, I should have a Z in there. Magnification or minimization, and also referred to as turning everything into a catastrophe. And this is when the negative aspects of a situation are magnified while any positive aspects are minimized. So an example might be, after reviewing the feedback concerning her presentation, Melanie said, "Most people had positive things to say about my presentation, but 2 people said it wasn't very clear. I guess it wasn't very good." Well, now this is taking things way out of context. Most people said they enjoyed the presentation. Only 2 people said they didn't like it. Okay, so that's maximization and minimization. Another one is discounting the positive, sometimes referred to as turning gold into lead. And this occurs when a compliment or favorable outcome is transformed into something negative. An example, "He only said that because he wants a favor from me. He doesn't really mean it." So obviously the person gave her a compliment, and yet she is discounting the positive and saying he only said that because he has some ulterior motive. Another example, overgeneralization, also known as the use of absolutes like always, never, everyone, etc., is when a single incident or a specific person serves as a basis for judging all instances in the same way. "I never get text messages. Nobody likes me." Well, that's an overgeneralization. "The traffic lights are always against me when I'm late for work." That's an overgeneralization also. Let's take a look at the next one, labeling or awfulizing. I like that word, awfulizing. This is when a negative label is applied to a single situation or person. "He's a complete idiot." What do you expect? He's a politician. He doesn't know anything. So that's giving a negative or pejorative label. Another cognitive distortion. Okay, we have musts, shoulds, and oughts. Life is lived. The person who is involved in this kind of thinking, this kind of cognitive distortion, sees life as being lived by a set of rigid rules that are applied to everyone, but typically disproportionately to the person themselves. "I should never be late. I ought to try and do better." These are things that are filled with shoulds and oughts and musts and doubts and stuff like that. Next one, emotional reasoning. Now this is seeing the feeling as evidence and proof of the thought. "I feel panicky. This means something bad is going to happen." Well, that's not, feelings are not evidence and proof of a thought. Logic and reasoning would be good evidence and proof of a thought. So this is a cognitive distortion. And the last one, selective judging. Judging the whole on the basis of a very small negative aspect. "The evening was a disaster because the wine was not chilled enough." Well, it could have been a lovely meal and a lovely evening, and it could have almost been incidental that the wine was not at its perfect temperature. That's selective judging. Okay, so those are 10 typical cognitive classifications of cognitive distortions. And although you will not be in the role of a cognitive behavioral therapist, it's important that you are able to recognize these cognitive distortions, especially if you are working with a client and they continuously engage in this type of distorted thinking. You may be able to help the individual redirect their thinking and behavior by offering them objective feedback concerning their thinking and its consequences. Remember the importance of feedback that we talked about in terms of the Johari window and expanding the announced self and shrinking the hidden and concealed self. And so by offering feedback to individuals, you may be offering a way of helping them to expand their announced self. Okay, now next we're going to look at some ways you might engage the individual who appears to continuously engage in these cognitive distortions. Again, if we are working with clients who tend to engage in faulty thinking, cognitive distortions, or negative automatic thoughts, keep in mind that this may be a coping strategy that they have developed over a long, long period of time, and it may be deeply ingrained and may even be operating at an unconscious level. They may be totally unaware of the kinds of behavior they're engaging in. However, thinking errors, or the cliche is stinking thinking, can play a large part in keeping people miserable. Also, depression, anxiety, addiction, anger, and guilt often stem from or are made worse by faulty thinking. By addressing these thought patterns with clients, you may, one, help them to not turn molehills into mountains. Two, you may help them to focus on things they can change as opposed to things they have no control over and they can't change. And three, you may help them identify and eliminate thought patterns that are keeping them stuck in a rut. So here are some good guiding questions you might use when engaging in feedback. And here are the guiding questions. Number one, you might ask the individual, what evidence or information is there to show that your understanding of the situation is accurate? And how much are you willing to bet on the accuracy of this information or evidence that you have? So that can really sort of facilitate a person having to refocus their thinking and to think about this question. What's the evidence I'm basing my conclusions on here? Number two, is there another way of looking at this? So an activating situation, an activating incident happens. The person has a thought, and it's a cognitive distortion, let's say. And so the question you're asking, is there another way of looking at this? Is there valid evidence to support an alternative explanation than what you thought happened? Number three, what would be so bad if your initial understanding proved to be accurate? So there was an activating event, you had a thought, and what would be so bad if your initial thought proved to be accurate? So the person was walking down the street, across the street from you, looked you in the eye, and then they crossed the street to get away from you. And you said, oh, I guess they must be mad at me or they don't like me. Well, that might be a cognitive distortion, but let's say it's not. Then what would be so bad if that were so? And what is the best and worst case scenarios that could happen if that were so? It's another way of refocusing or redirecting the person to start to think about what is going on. Number four, what could you do to cope if this really is the case? Well, if your cognition, if your thought was true, was reality-based, then what could you do to cope with that situation? How could you deal with it? Number five, what are the consequences of your believing your understanding is accurate? If you believe your thought or your understanding is accurate, what are the consequences of that? And number six, how can you change your understanding after weighing up all the evidence to make the situation less distressing? So these are some really good guiding questions you might use when engaged in giving feedback. It actually might be a very good strategy to teach your clients how to self-question, how to use these questions themselves. So in terms of question number 1, you might teach them to say, well, what evidence or information is there to show that my understanding of the situation is accurate? And how much am I willing to bet on the accuracy? So you might teach them how these questions so that they can start to examine themselves. Well, that's the module. So here is the outline of what we looked at. We looked at where cognitive behavior therapy intervention fits in the behavior change continuum, and it fits in that middle position. We talked about the model and the interconnectedness between thought, emotion, and behavior. And we talked about 10 classifications of cognitive distortions or negative automatic thoughts, and they were black and white thinking, jumping to conclusions, and so on. You can read those. And finally, we talked about guiding questions that you might use in a discussion with a client in order to give them some feedback and have them do some introspection and some thinking about what they are actually thinking about and what their emotions are and how it's affecting their behaviors. Well, thank you very much, and we will see you in the next module.